So, looks like they're still at the house, which is, Jesus. I mean, we live 10 minutes away, but come on.
I relate.
Thank you all very much for coming out. I don't have any real introduction except I've known Beth since about when we opened the store. I don't know, anyway, many years back. So she published a book of music essays at that time and done a few more things in between, I think. And now this, so, but you know why you're here. And Courtney Minick is with her.
Hi.
Here lies the story. So, take it away. We've got basically an hour and a half. We got a show at 5, a trio, so feel free to stay, leave a book in the chair if you're going to stay for that. But we will have a little bit of scurrying around at 4:30, so just all right, okay.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Yeah, thanks for hosting, and thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to Courtney for being with me. I met her fairly early on in my cemetery research, and it was just great to find somebody else who was as weird and nerdy about this subject as I am. So we bond a lot over things that nobody else wants to talk about. So I'm going to start by reading a little bit from the book, and then we will get into the conversation. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. John Orr was born in Ireland in 1824. But tracing his life story prior to his arrival in San Francisco in the 1850s is tricky, especially since his name isn't uncommon. In 1840, a 16-year-old musician named John Orr from Donegal, Ireland, joined the ranks of the U.S. military in New York. If this is our John Orr, he was a slight lad, 5'3", with gray eyes, light hair, and a fair complexion. He next appears in the Daily Alta California on December 12, 1850, among a list of passengers arriving in San Francisco on the steamship New Orleans from Panama. He pops up in a brief newspaper item from January 29, 1852, after he was fined $5 for fighting with a man named Caleb Coakley, and again a couple weeks later when he was found in contempt of court. Quote, John Orr was arrested for not appearing at court to prosecute a suit in which he was the complainant. Maybe he was suing Coakley over the fight, but it doesn't say. But, quote, he was excused on account of sickness, the Daily Alta California reported. On June 9, 1854, Orr died of unknown causes, perhaps from the same illness that caused him to miss his court date, and he was buried on June 10th, when he became the first person buried in San Francisco's brand new cemetery, Lone Mountain. His tombstone read, in memory of the first inhabitant of this silent city. John Orr's wife, although it's not clear whether this is the wife of the same John, gave birth to a daughter, September 7th, 1854, in Jackass Gulch, deep in the gold country of Amador County. The gold rush and San Francisco's population boom forced San Francisco to expand its cemeteries. City officials, realizing they were quickly running out of space in Yerba Buena Cemetery, decided in 1853 to approach the owner of Lone Mountain's lands to ask whether they would sell to the city. It must have gone well, because by the end of the month, crews were already at work clearing undergrowth and laying out 8 miles of avenues that would run through the cemetery grounds. The footprint of Lone Mountain Cemetery Complex would now be roughly bounded by California, Arguello, and Fulton Streets, and Presidio Avenue, which back then was known as Cemetery Avenue. After witnessing how the Jewish cemeteries at today's Dolores Park became destination spots for strolling and picnicking, and watching as other cities developed similar garden or rural cemeteries, San Francisco leaders wanted Lone Mountain to be part of the trend. Quote, Some very beautiful spots are brought to view by these improvements, and in this season of the year, when the grass and foliage are green and the wild lilac is in bloom and the laurel and berry, is the most favorable time to visit these beautiful grounds, an Alta reporter wrote the day before Christmas, 1853. Orr's grave became part of the massive 170-acre property that sprawled across the middle of San Francisco, in an area that now includes Laurel Heights, Anza Vista, and the Inner Richmond. It was eventually subdivided into smaller cemeteries, a silent city that would eventually house more than 136,000 inhabitants. They were outnumbered by the living by a ratio of only about 3-1. Lone Mountain was dedicated on May 31st, 1854, in what the Alta deemed the most pleasing and interesting public ceremony that we have ever witnessed in California. Quote, "The weather was exceedingly pleasant, the roads leading to the consecrated ground were in fine condition, and everything conspired to entice the lovers of rural beauty and elevated sentiment to participate in the solemnities of the day. Large numbers of citizens, nearly 1/2 of whom were women, were in attendance at the Dell, the most beautiful and sequestered spot in the grounds," an Alta reporter wrote. By 1862, 8 years after the cemetery opened, 7,000 people had been buried at Lone Mountain, with about 75 new interments each month. Sections were laid out for the Protestant Orphan Asylum, firefighters, the Typographical Union, and many other organizations. Its owners continued to be optimistic about its longevity. Quote, "The present proprietors of the cemetery are J.H. Atkinson, C.C. Butler, and Nathaniel Gray. They think there is room in the cemetery to bury all of the dead for San Francisco for half a century to come," reported the Daily Alta California. Foreshadowing. Not everyone felt so positively about the cemetery, or its name at least. Some felt that calling it Lone Mountain was creepy and grim. This was long before Tolkien released his book The Hobbit, featuring a lonely mountain inhabited by a greedy dragon called Smaug. Even before the cemetery was dedicated, the Daily Alta California ran a letter to the editor complaining about the name. Quote, "A more unfortunate selection of a name for the new cemetery could not have been made than that of Lone Mountain. How lugubrious, how chilling, one's very soul shrinks from it. The idea of desolation, of complete isolation, a mountain in a wilderness, a place of resort for the owls and the bats, and perhaps a solitary wolf, are the thoughts that present themselves to the imagination. A place to be avoided rather than sought after as a final resting place. The idea of the grave is of itself revolting to our nature and requires no accessories to add to the gloom. What more painful, after having consigned the remains of a dear friend to its embrace, than the thoughts that obtrude themselves into our minds in the silent hours of the night? The cold grave, the clods of the valley, the sleep that knows no waking, etc., are all gloomy enough without having that grave in Lone Mountain. This is carrying the funeral into all time and making it perpetual. It partakes too much of the undertaker for my taste. I would not bury the remains of a dear friend in such a spot, however beautiful it might be, the name of which conveys the view of utter abandonment, as Lone Mountain does. We hope that the trustees of the cemetery will give it a more cheerful title. Let it be Pyramid Mount, Sunnyside Cemetery, Mount Olivet Cemetery, anything other than Lone Mountain. And that is signed Old Mortality." I love that letter so much. Thank you.
Ooh, thank you. So, you know what? I'm going to go off script now because already I'm thinking about what happened to Lone Mountain and those cemeteries as time progressed, right? So one of the things that you talk about in your book is what happened to the cemeteries when they fell into disrepair before they were removed. Okay. I have like some really choice quotes here, but first I want to juxtapose that beautiful scenery, you know, with the that name, Lone Mountain. It's too scary. Well, 40 years later, it would be really appropriate.
Yeah.
So tell us what happened.
Well, the people running the cemeteries in the latter half of the 19th century, they knew that you needed to charge people for a burial, but they hadn't figured out yet that you need to like charge an ongoing fee for upkeep. And without that money, without the city paying for anything, like they got really weedy and the plants died and things got overgrown. People were knocking over headstones. In some places, the wind was blowing the sand off the coffins, so graves would be exposed. And this was at the same time, like when they started, people were taking day trips out to the cemeteries to have like a picnic in the park, basically.
Yeah, that was the garden cemetery ideal, right? Was that it would replace or would be a substitute for parks in the city.
Exactly. And it was far away from downtown. Like,
Right.
it was an okay place for a cemetery because it wasn't near anything. But then people started building out and building out and building out. And then once there were thousands of people in the Richmond district, they were like, I don't really want to be living next to this shabby looking cemetery. And they started, you know, NIMBYism is eternal. They started pushing the city to do something about it.
Right. And I guess we should back up and mention that the reason that they didn't have any more money coming in is because the city banned burials, right? Do you want to mention that?
Yeah, I mean, even before then, nobody was paying for perpetual upkeep. But then, I think it was 1895, 1896, the city signed a law saying you could not sell any more burial plots, was the first part. And then in 1901, they banned burials completely. So the cemeteries could be there, but you couldn't bury anybody anew. And then the 1906 earthquake happened and knocked over a bunch more of the headstones, and everything just looked worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, I actually have a quote. This is quoted in your book, too, about what the cemeteries looked like. Oh, thought I had a quote. Hold on. I have my little post-it notes, you guys. Okay. This is a quote about Laurel Hill Cemetery, which is what you were just describing.
Right. Lone Mountain.
Lavender, beautiful garden cemetery. This is like what happens when it becomes actual Lone Mountain, right? Let's see. San Francisco's burial grounds became prone to theft and mischief. Coffins were taken from mausoleums and bones strewn about. Entire skeletons were carried away to be used for Halloween decorations, or, despite their apparent protestations, presented to high school and college biology and anatomy teachers. Okay, this is just a cemetery in the middle of the city.
Yeah.
This is what it's become. People are stealing whole skeletons out to decorate for Halloween. Children hiking in the cemeteries became accustomed to discovering gruesome relics, such as bones protruding from the ground. Some actually engaged in kickball contests with human skulls. On foggy nights, college fraternities found the desecrated cemeteries a made-to-order venue for their macabre initiation rites. I'm assuming this is like fraternity shit, right?
I would assume so.
Drinking bouts and sexual orgies. Anguished neighbors complained about the hideous laughing and eerie screams emanating from the darkened graveyards. So maybe that's what happens when you originally name it Lone Mountain and it lives up to its name. Because, and that's not that old. That's like the 1930s. So this was happening in the 1930s.
Yeah, and even before the cemeteries were completely, like, it took 40 years to clear all the cemeteries, dig up the dead, move them to Colma, which was a massive process. But soldiers were training for World War II in darkened cemeteries at night, like doing field training and stuff. And they were rightfully unnerved by it.
There's actually a story. Someone mentioned Trina Lopez's documentary earlier, and there's a story in there of during World War II, they actually had searchlights stationed up at Lone Mountain, right, to look for incoming aircraft.
Yeah.
And one of the soldiers is interviewed, and he said that people would be really skeeved out about being in this graveyard at night during a blackout. So the city would be dark, right? And he said one time he saw a dog come up, a stray dog, and it had a bone in its mouth. And he thought, oh, it's just a dog with a bone, but it was a femur.
Yeah.
It was a human bone in its mouth. And this is World War II.
Yeah.
So it's not that long ago.
Is there a record of what schools ended up with the skeletons?
Not that I'm aware of.
I doubt it. Yeah. I mean, we'll get into some more later about what happened with some of these remains, but it was kind of a free-for-all. Okay, I'm going to take it back to the beginning.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about where some of our interests overlap, because we're both very interested in what happened when the cemeteries were removed and who got left behind.
Yeah.
Because this is like the spoiler alert for Beth's book. A lot of people got left behind. They did not do a great job removing the dead. Some did better than others, but a lot of them were left behind.
Yeah.
And they make themselves known even today for construction projects and some other ways. So I want to ask you about Mission Dolores.
Okay.
And can you tell us a little bit about Mission Dolores, how that, as you guys may know, there's a churchyard at Mission Dolores. It's one of the few cemeteries left in the city. Can you tell us a little bit about what's left there and how that topography has changed?
Well, the Mission used to be a much bigger property, built strategically on indigenous land next to a creek. So, you know, it was good for indigenous living, but then also when the missionaries arrived, they're like, well, this is a great spot. Plus, we've got all this labor. We can, I don't even want to get into that.
They paid him well, right?
But yeah, I mean, the mission lands extended quite a ways in either direction. Right now, I think it's bounded by 16th and Dolores, and then it goes about halfway back, and then Chula Lane. The cemetery itself used to go all the way back to Church Street and possibly a little bit into what's under Church Street. It definitely went under where 16th Street is today. Definitely went under where Dolores Street is today. And it is one of the few cemeteries that was allowed to remain in the city. I cannot remember the details of why they got to stay there, perhaps because of the historic interest of that property and the church. But as they wanted to extend 16th Street, it didn't go beyond the church at that time. And the mission was like, well, okay, but we've got a cemetery partly under there, so we need money from the city to move all the dead. And the city was like, okay, and then they didn't pay up, and they didn't pay up, and they didn't pay up. And finally the church had dug up everybody except 2 people and said, we're leaving these people here until the city gives us our money. So that eventually happened. For the most part, people who were relocated, and the same thing happened with Dolores Street. For the most part, people who were relocated were folded back into the main part of the cemetery that was not being moved or monkeyed with in any way. So now what you have, it used to be about an acre. It's now about a third of an acre.
So they're just compressed into... so like what you see now is actually, there's much more underneath.
The area that's behind the current property was also laid out with headstones and graves. Headstones were removed. The graves were paved over. It's now a playground for the Catholic Church that's behind the property. And there's an estimated 10 or 11,000 graves on the site with about 200 headstones. And about half of those are indigenous people who worked and were poorly treated and died at the cemetery or at the mission.
Yeah, the numbers I've heard is that actually underneath Mission Dolores, there's something between 5,000 and 6,000 indigenous people buried there. I want to show you this picture. This is a picture that when Beth and I were getting to know each other, I sent her. And we love this photo, and I'll show you why. This is, so she talked about there's what would you call it? A playground back behind the church. You can see that this is as big as I could get it. These cracks appear every now and then under the pavement, and they're like roughly coffin shaped.
Yeah.
So it's not anything supernatural. It just has to do with the shifting ground. And so this comes up on the...
Can you stand up and show that? Oh.
I don't have a projector for you guys, but you can see it, yeah. And it's kind of crazy. It's one of the ways, which, one of the themes I'm interested in, and you as well, is that the dead continue to make themselves known.
They're like,
in the
we're
city.
still here.
We're still here.
But yeah, to go back to something that you said, there are a couple archaeologists in the city who've estimated that there were about 206,000 burials in the city between the mission period and 1901, and about 150,000 were moved to Colma. Like, that's the official number. So simple math tells us that there could be 50 to 60,000 people still here in various places. Mission Dolores would be one of them. So we know where 11,000 of them are, but
well, another area where we know bodies were left behind, and there's some sketchy math on this one too, but is Yerba Buena Cemetery, which is now where Civic Center is. So can you tell us about Yerba Buena and what happened to that cemetery?
Yeah, so prior to the gold rush, there were all these like tiny little cemeteries just outside of the sort of cove area where the ferry building and Barcadero financial district are now. And all of a sudden, people were flooding into the city. I think the population went from like 2,000 to 36,000 in the course of a year or two.
With the gold rush.
With the gold rush. And a lot of people were living in very substandard conditions. People were living in tents. They were living in ramshackle cabins with too many people. Many diseases were floating around, cholera, tuberculosis, and a lot of people died. And the city went, we need somewhere kind of official and big enough to bury these people. So they staked out a spot. It's the Market, Larkin, and McAllister. So that triangle where the Asian Art Museum is, and the main library, UN Plaza. And the surveyor famously said, we can bury people here for the next 50 years. And like, they were completely full by, I think it was 1858. It was like 8
it was
years.
like 10 years. Yeah. Filled up.
Yeah. And estimates vary, but it was probably 7,000 to 9,000 people buried in that spot. And it was a while before they could relocate anybody from that cemetery. Some of them went to the new cemeteries on Lone Mountain, and about 300 went to City Cemetery, which was established out where Land's End is. But as far as we know, most of those people are still there. And the important thing to note about that is that because it was a public cemetery, it was where the most poor people of the city were buried. These were people that the city paid to bury after they died penniless. It was also one of the only places, in fact, the only place that the Chinese were allowed to bury their dead for a long time. And so it becomes very meaningful that these were among the people that were never moved anywhere else. And this is also a site where we've seen so much construction. Like, the original City Hall, like, over time there were 3 buildings on the same property. There was the original City Hall, and then the main library, and then the Asian Art Museum. And every time there's been excavation work on that site, they found more people.
Every time. Yeah, and not just there, other areas in the Civic Center, too. It kind of seems like every time since the 1880s, they go to do construction, they find coffins, they find bodies. Yeah. They just did not do a very thorough job moving those people. There's a good anecdote that I like about Rose Pack and the Asian Art Museum. Do you want to tell?
Do you have you don't have the quote in front of you?
No, I don't have it.
So many of you probably remember Rose Pack, who was a political leader in San Francisco, who died just a few years ago. At this time, I think she was running the Chinese Chamber of Commerce. And when they were getting ready to open the Asian Art Museum, she's like, there are a lot of people who are not going to come to the Asian Art Museum if they know there's a cemetery underneath it. So, like, she's like, we have to pay respect to the dead. And they brought in, I think there was like a Tibetan Buddhist ceremony. And
lama,
then another interfaith ceremony. So this was like the only place that I know of where like ceremonies were performed to help quiet the dead so they wouldn't bother the visitors to the museum.
Yeah, So we don't know that they've done that at Legion of Honor, do we? Because we'll get to that in a minute. But I doubt it.
I doubt it.
Well, yeah. I mean, Rose Pack basically said, because when they broke ground for the Asian Art Museum, they found more bodies, right? Just every time.
Yeah.
And she said, I think the quote was something like, I'm not coming in to this museum. And, you could not defy Rose Pack. That was like a non-starter in the day, right?
Yeah.
And she said, I'm not coming to this museum until you do something to honor the people who were still buried here. Yeah.
And, just as an aside, I think we should probably be doing that in way more places.
Oh, agreed.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about City Cemetery next?
Yeah, sure.
It's kind of the same theme. Because
Yeah.
some of those people were moved from
A tiny few.
Yerba Buena. Yeah. To City Cemetery, which was the new Pottersfield, like Pauper's burial ground.
Yeah. So in about 1870, the city opened a new cemetery meant to replace Yerba Buena. Now, if you've done the math, like Yerba Buena closed in 1858, 1860. So there was a 10-year period where I'm not even sure
where were they burying them?
I don't know. But
who knows?
It was 200 acres close to Land's End. And I think it's about, there were almost 30,000 people buried there over the course of its operation. So it's between 1870 and 1901. About half of those were poor, and the other half were some fraternal organizations and some international organizations.
Yeah.
There was a small plot for sailors, and it became the place where the Chinese also buried their dead. So there were thousands of Chinese buried there. Some of them were, according to tradition, dug up and sent back home to their families in China, but some were not because they just didn't have any local people to take care of them, and they're still there. And in fact, one of the things that's unique about City Cemetery, aside from the fact that almost everybody who was buried there is still there, is that a couple of the monuments are still there. So there's a large Chinese monument you may have seen if you've driven out by the golf course. It's this big sort of squarish gateway thing, and it's
like an arch. Yeah.
And then there's an obelisk that was for the Ladies Seamen's Friend Society, which was like a benevolent group that like took care of sailors who came here and died with no money. And so people are out there on a daily basis playing golf among these monuments and on top of graves that
and just to like really clarify it for everybody, that site where there was a cemetery where 30,000 people were buried is now a golf course and a museum, and those people are still there. They never moved them, right? And we didn't know about this, or I should say a lot of people knew about it. The city didn't really acknowledge it until just last year. But when you're out there at Lincoln Park, that is an actual cemetery. There are 20, we estimate, about 20,000 people buried there still. And we now have some recognition about it. Maybe you want to talk about that real quick, too.
Yeah, so, I mean, to back up a little bit, the Legion of Honor Museum was built in the early 1920s by Alma Spreckels, who is a famously wealthy woman in San Francisco. She wanted to commemorate the dead of World War I. And I think even by then they had forgotten that this was a cemetery. And
and it had only been 20 years. So when they go to break ground for Legion of Honor, this is just like, imagine, this is like where your people are buried. 20 years, not that long, right?
So they began digging for the museum. They immediately came across some sort of mausoleum or pit of graves. And again, this is ground zero for where the poor people were being buried in the cemetery. And they broke the bones in the course of digging, and they just swept them off to the side.
They bulldozed them.
And buried them again. This is, again, the 1920s. We did not have the same archaeological preservation laws that we do now. But the Legion of Honor had to do seismic work in the 1990s and came across, I think it's 900 sets of
That's- yeah.
remains. It's tricky to count because this was also a place where medical people who were subject to medical experimentation after death were also buried. So unfortunately, there were some solo limbs and things like that.
Pits of bones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
It's nice.
so that was in the 90s.
Yeah.
And those bones had to go to the coroner. They had to do archaeological work. One of the historians was like, "This is costing us so much money per day. Why do we have to do this?"
Oh, this is like a whole situation.
Yeah.
And I think in the 20s when they found this stuff, I mean, it was definitely a different era. We had gone through World War One, which was horrifying, right? And then we'd also just gone through the Spanish flu pandemic. So knowing what we know now about how these events traumatize the population, imagine your workers out there. Maybe you were in World War One, right?
Yeah.
And you come back and you're told to break ground for this fancy museum, and you're finding just bodies everywhere, right? Nobody warned them. Nobody told them. Nobody came in and said, let's send a archaeologist out here, or let's whatever. No, they just told him, get rid of them. And in the 90s, when they found these bones again, it was described, this is like the most cursed phrase in existence. It was described as a charnel heap, right? It's just a pile of bones that they, just kind of swept over to the side in the 20s. And then in the 90s, they did a better job, but I still have some feelings about it.
Yeah, and
I'm sure you do too.
at the time, they put together a display in the museum of things that they found in people's coffins. Like, I don't know the specifics, but coins, jewelry, little
guns. They found guns.
Were there guns?
Yeah.
Okay.
People got buried with their guns.
Unfortunately, that display isn't still there. I'm wondering what happened to it. But anyway, just last year, through the efforts of historian Woody LaBounty and Supervisor Connie Chan's office, they have named this place a city landmark. And the landmarking is specifically for the cemetery. It's not for the Legion of Honor. It's not for the golf course. It's for the cemetery. So there's a sign out there now with the map, recreated map with all the plots. And it acknowledges that there are still thousands of people buried there.
Yeah. It's still kind of crazy, though, because if you look at that big expanse of greenway and everything, and there's like a plaque on the side, like over here, right? Like, you would never know unless,
Yeah.
Where's the sign?
It's on,
I think there are two. I think there's one by the Kong Chau, right? Or no?
I don't think there is, but, what is it? Camino del Mar? Yeah, about halfway down. If you go down from the Legion of Honor, it's off to the side.
On the ocean side over there by a sea cliff, which is also, I mean, they still, when I talked to Woody about it, he was saying that even on Camino del Mar and those streets over there, anytime they have to do plumbing work, pipe work, construction where they go underground, they have to call the coroner because they're most likely going to find bones down there, because I think even then they didn't, the exact geographic boundaries of the cemetery were not, they were porous, right?
Yeah.
People got buried off on the margins and stuff too. Yeah. I want to ask you, by the way, if you have heard, because I have heard some things about anything being haunted from I'm gonna when we get to Masonic, I have some good ones, but like I meant to ask you, Yerba Buena Civic Center or City Cemetery. Beth, do you think it's haunted?
I don't want to answer that
Metaphorically,
question.
literally.
So there is a great story in my Mission Dolores chapter where a local police officer brings I think it's a Californian reporter into the cemetery, and as they're walking in, he's like, "Do you believe in ghosts?" And he tells this story, like he's going into the cemetery one night to visit his uncle's grave, and like one of the trees lifts his police hat off of his head, and it freaks him out. So he believes that there are ghosts in the cemetery. And I have heard of other people who believe like the mission site or places nearby have ghostly activity. I think what is it, the Orpheum Theater that's right there on the edge of
Oh,
Yerba Buena.
yeah.
I've heard a few things about that.
I
but
hadn't thought about that
yeah.
because that would have been
Yeah.
near Yerba Buena.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that place is supposed to be haunted for sure.
And I've heard that City Hall is haunted, but that is like outside
Yes.
the boundaries.
So, so what I heard about City Hall, so City Hall is supposedly haunted, as is the Asian Art Museum. So I guess like they did a little bit, but I hear Asian art is haunted. But City Hall, I hear, is haunted by Milk and Moscone. That's the ghost in City Hall. So
Good.
I don't know, you
Good.
guys.
Good.
We moved forward 100 years in
Yeah.
the timeline
Yeah.
to find those ghosts. But
Yeah.
okay, all right. I want to ask you. There's another ghost story with this one, which I'll tell when we get to it. But I want to ask you about the removal process when they moved, because they moved all of them, right? So some of the cemeteries did a better job of moving bodies. So tell us, where'd they put them, first of all?
Yeah.
How'd they get them there? What the hell was that like, right?
It was a separate process. So by the time the cemetery shut down, there were 5 cemeteries on Lone Mountain. There had been a Chinese cemetery that, again, moved out to City Cemetery. There was Masonic, there was Oddfellows, there was Calvary, which became the new big Catholic cemetery. And then there was Laurel Hill, which was, Lone Mountain did eventually get renamed to something a little more cheerful. And each one of those had its own separate process because it was controlled by a different organization. The rumor is that Cavalry did the best job. They had screens up and they had careful digging. I think they probably had better records to begin with.
It was the church.
The church tends to keep reasonably good records.
Yeah.
They had a priest observing all of the process. And when they were excavating this area, it's like where that Target is now, Geary and Masonic.
Trader Joe's, yeah.
When they were digging all that stuff up some years ago, they found a lot of headstones, but they didn't find any graves.
Yeah, that's what I've heard also.
Yeah.
And just to give people an idea, I just jotted down the numbers here. That was 55,000 people moved out of Calvary. So that's a lot of graves.
Yeah.
And where did they bring them?
They went to Holy Cross, and I think in many cases...
In Colma.
In many cases, they were like, because you had the person and the headstone, you could transport those together and bury them together.
Oh, okay. They're the only ones that did that, though, right?
I believe so.
Yeah.
For example, there's a really kind of awful story about the Oddfellows Cemetery.
Oh, yeah.
They were moved en masse to Green Lawn Cemetery in Colma, but a separate section of Green Lawn Cemetery. It is now a vacant lot that's between
depressing.
The Best Buy and the
It's
Home
awful.
Depot. There's a single monument. You cannot get to it. The land was rented to a flower farm for several years, and there are descendants.
Do they grow like extra beautiful flowers from all the nutrients in the soil?
I hope so. But there are family members trying to get that place recognized and accessible again because...
I mean, Oddfellows also, from the reporting of the time, the Oddfellows Cemetery is where Rossi Park is. I don't know if you guys know. On Arguello, where the pool is, there's a public pool there. That was Oddfellows Cemetery. And they, I don't know why, they didn't have the money or whatever. They did not screen the work, meaning they were digging up graves while people were driving down Arguello. Right? It was just happening there, right? So imagine you're like living across the street and they're digging up graves. They left some behind at Oddfellows, we know, because in 2006, they found a coffin with a well-preserved child's corpse in it. Do you want to tell us about that coffin, Beth?
Yeah, so... I can't remember the woman's name, but it was just routine, like, house renovation.
Yeah, she was, like, putting a deck in or something in her yard, yeah.
And the workmen found, I think it was just this edge of this thing that was glass and lead, and they uncovered it, and it was a coffin for a little girl, and they had no idea who this was.
Yeah. So imagine, you're going to dig up a deck, right? You're putting a deck in your yard, and there is an old-timey coffin
Yeah.
in the ground there. That is Oddfellows.
You know, her dress was still preserved. She had like eucalyptus flowers and lavender and stuff.
Yeah,
And
it's really like heartbreaking. Yeah.
and through the work of researchers, there's a group called, I think it's Garden of Innocence.
I think so.
And a couple of others were able to recreate a map of Oddfellows cemeteries so they could figure out what family plot this property was in, and then sort of surmised that she would have been the daughter of these people. Were able to confirm, like, because the coffin was so unusual, they were able to find the maker of the coffin and sort of like figure that stuff out.
The
and
serial number, I think. Yeah.
And then I said this wrong recently, but actually they did do some DNA testing to connect her to living family to confirm who she was.
Yes.
So right after they found her, they reburied her in a cemetery in Colma and nicknamed her Miranda Eve.
Yeah.
But then once they revealed her identity, I think she was reburied again. Her name is Edith Howard Cook. She died a little before the age of 3 from severe malnutrition, but it was malnutrition caused by another illness. So,
yeah, she clearly came from a well-to-do family.
Yeah.
She had a beautiful casket. The homeowner who discovered this, she called the police, right? And the police came out and they called the coroner. And the coroner said, okay, well, this is old. There used to be a cemetery here, so it's not a crime. We're not worried about it. And she was like, okay, well, all right, take the coffin. And he said, no, this is private property. Like, this is your property now. San Francisco coroner. And so this poor woman was left with this, like, so luckily this group called Garden of Innocence, they do a lot of charitable work burying murdered children who are unidentified or don't have, it's like really sad work, but really important work. And they are the ones who organize to pay for her to be reinterred and everything. And so the woman who the homeowner told the Chronicle that before they found it, they heard she had what she thought was a child ghost in her house. She had little footsteps running around. She had the sense that there was a ghost in the house, and that it was.
She said she heard giggling sometimes.
Yeah,
I mean, she
stuff
has
like
her own
that.
children, but this was like extra giggling.
And she said that when the child was reinterred, it stopped.
Yeah.
So it's kind of I mean, I don't know, believe what you want, but it's kind of a nice way to tie that story up and have a kind of a positive ending anyway.
Yeah. How about one more question from you, and then maybe we'll take some audience questions.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a gross question. Because when you and I were talking about what we were going to talk about, you were like, let's talk about the things that we like or what we're interested, like the soap making. And I was like, what is she talking about? And then I had this like, oh, is she talking about what I think she's talking about? So why don't you tell us that story?
Yeah, this was a
Disgusting.
very random article from somebody who was not even from San Francisco. He was just visiting. And he was walking past the Yerba Buena Cemetery grounds one day, and people were digging again. And he's like, what are you doing? And they said, there's this, when the bodies decompose, there's this chemical
Adipocere.
that we can make soap out of. And so they were making soap from the remains of the dead. Like, this is even a step beyond the stealing of skeletons.
Halloween skeletons, doctors, sawbones, but making soap. So, all right, thank you for that.
I mean, maybe it's a recycling process.
No, it's not. It's gross. No, it's not good. It's not good. Okay.
Anybody have any questions? Yeah, you.
Where were the wealthy families putting their mausoleums during this period?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, the ones that I'm thinking of are things like the Senators' Row in Laurel Hill. David Broderick and a bunch of other senators have these fairly massive monuments. If you look through the book, you'll see some of the pictures. Like, you can see them from quite a distance. But there was no like super elite cemetery, but definitely Laurel Hill and Calvary, I
Yeah,
think
I
were
think
the two
so.
sort of most wealthy. And I think actually it costs quite a lot to be buried in the Jewish cemeteries too.
Yes, I think those were
Yeah.
very nice, very well maintained, and they did a good job of moving their people out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
So there's probably nobody in Dolores Park.
So the mausoleums got moved.
Oh yeah. And in many cases, you may know this, but the stones were broken up and used in other things around the city. So the breakwaters at Aquatic Park and the St. Francis Yacht Club, the wave organ is built
Yeah.
entirely out of the stuff that happens in cemeteries. You know, the walls and
Yeah,
the fences.
some of
and-
those big vaults were put out at Ocean Beach to extend to make breakwaters,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And in Buena Vista Park too, the drainage ditches are lined with headstones. Jim.
Was there a lot of criminal, like people that were like, obviously had all these graves, there must have been people, stuff with the buried, people must have been fencing those kind of, I mean, I would assume there was,
I
could have been
would-
a big business.
I think so, probably.
Yeah, I would suspect so. A lot of the dead were dug up too for early medical research. Because cadavers were not readily
Anatomists,
available
yeah.
yet. There was also, I think, a side business like the city and county hospital. If they had somebody die who was poor, they would often donate their body for medical research, and the researcher was supposed to give them a proper burial afterwards, and that happened sometimes, but not all the time. There were also. There's a story in the book. There was a man living in one of the tombs for a while, and he was only discovered because he hung out his laundry to dry during the day. And a police officer wandered by, and he said, "What are you doing?" And so there's this amazing like jailhouse interview of how he survived in a tomb for a couple of months. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Why Colma? I've always wondered how come it ended up that Colma is where all these folks ended
Well,
up.
it's a good question. The city kept trying to find places outside the city limits to bury the dead, and the city limits kept moving and moving and moving. Like one of those last efforts was the Catholic Church had bought land near Lake Merced and had managed to bury about 10 people before the city said, you cannot do this. And so Colma was the thing beyond the city limits that remained beyond the city limits, and it didn't expand in the way that San Francisco did. It's still like, I think it's like 1 million graves and like
Yeah.
1,500 living residents.
Yeah.
So it just became that convenient place that we didn't develop into. Yeah.
I think it's spreading up Mount St. Bruno.
Yeah, everyone is, I've heard two things. One is that Colma has enough land forever, and the other is that they're going to run out of room and we're going to have to do something else. So, in the back.
I don't know if I missed something, but I thought Dolores Park was a Jewish cemetery.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, there were 2 Jewish cemeteries sharing that space for quite a while. It seems like probably all of those dead were moved. Again, they were good at record keeping, but there are in city documents warnings that like be careful if you have to dig in Dolores Park, because if you find something archaeological, you have to deal with it responsibly. So
Yeah, there was also a plot up at City Cemetery for Jewish burials, right? And they also moved all their people.
they did one at least
Allegedly.
one headstone was left behind that was found by kids who were digging in the cemetery in the 60s. They unearthed this Jewish headstone, which then was kept on display in the main library for a long time. I think it might now be in the
They
Jewish...
still have them, yeah. They put them out like every October.
Anyway, yeah.
Both of you, what got you interested in cemeteries and San Francisco cemeteries in particular? Is there something sort of unique, special about our history here?
I mean, I started on this in part because I wanted to learn. I've been living here for 20 years, and I felt like I didn't understand the city very well, like the history of the city. I've been a reporter here since the mid-2000s, so like I understand sort of the modern take on things. And then I started researching, just for fun. I just started researching some of the cemetery history and just found it so full of information that nobody knew about.
Yeah, it's compelling.
And, you know, like, I had to ask my partner every day, like, can I just tell you one new cemetery fact that I learned today? Because he and my daughter were getting a little tired of it. And then it turned into both a way to tell the story of the history of San Francisco, because like all of the things that happened here played out in what happened to the dead. And it also felt really resonant with everything that goes on now in terms of like,
Oh, for sure.
we're all packed in together and we don't want that homeless shelter next to us. We don't want that, you know, safe consumption site next to us. There's still rich people messing with property, and like all of these things that are in the book are still happening. They happen lots of places, but I think the fact that San Francisco is so small and so dense, just compounds everything.
Yeah. I actually got interested in it when I read the news article about Edith Howard Cook. That was in like 2006 when we were in law school. And I was like, oh my God, what? Like there was a cemetery there? And that's what actually got me started thinking about it. Because it's not something that most people know.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, if you want to shock someone, tell them there are 20,000 bodies under the Lincoln Park golf course, right? Nobody knows, right? And so that's, to me, that's compelling too. Yeah.
Audrey.
Was there ever a time or a place when people weren't segregated in cemeteries according to their religion? It seems so sort of sad to me.
I mean, that is a really deep question, because I'm like, okay, from the mission period onward in San Francisco, no. And then prior to that, it was indigenous. Did they have all the same religion? I don't know. But, you know, like...
Well, I think the indigent were mixed, right? Because if you were indigent, you didn't have a choice. You went into the potter's field. You're maybe intermingled. I actually don't know how they handled that.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Is it just about money? So, like, the church coughed up money for their Catholic people and synagogues for their Jewish people?
Yeah, and people who came to San Francisco joined the Oddfellows or the Freemasons to have like a found family that would take care of them when they died. Like, and same with the Chinese community. They had the different tongs that would pay for your burial when you died. That was like your community would take care of you, because so many people came here on their own. But there are still all of these ideas about, well, a Protestant can't be buried in a Catholic cemetery, or Catholic can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery. And there's a story of a military man buried in City Cemetery, probably because he ended his own life. So, like, the military didn't want to take care of him. The city kept saying, but this guy fought in the wars. Like, can't we find a nice place for him? And nobody would take him.
Yeah.
And we think that was probably the reason. So, we still have a lot of ideas about who's tainting whose burial ground, I guess. Caroline.
So I live up Ventura Hill.
Yeah.
And I live on a split street, so the lower half of that street, the even numbers, there was this space of time when all this terrible stuff was happening. We had like a really gruesome murder.
No.
And then pretty soon after, we had a big fire, and then there was something else happened. And I asked one of the neighbors, like, what's going on down there?
Yeah.
She said, oh, I've lived here for X amount of years. This stuff happens all the time on this side of the street. And I said, why? And she said, and I believe her, she was sort of a psychic and in touch with things that I was not in touch with. And she's like, oh, well, there's many, many Native American bones.
It could be.
So what am I mean, I've read your book, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And it made me think that basically all of San Francisco's burial ground.
Super haunted.
And probably super haunted.
Yeah.
But is there a map where I could find out if that is indeed true, and then do some sort of maybe? It's not my side of the street.
That's for those people to worry about. I did not map or track the indigenous burials of San Francisco because it didn't feel like my place to talk about for the most part. I think that if you Google, you can find some information. But also, you've read my book. There was a site in the Potrero by the water line where bones kept being found. And they were probably, again, people who'd been experimented on medically after their death. And, like, there was supposed to be an inquest that never happened. There were theories that the city and county hospital was, like, washing these people down the stream into the water.
The creek, yeah.
And they were, like, older bones and newer bones. And so they'd been doing this for a while. Yeah, it's really yucky. But
yeah, I mean, if you want to like think about who's haunting, it's probably not people who were buried thousands of years ago on their own land. It's probably people who were like they're experimented on after death, or that sounds experimented on sounds wrong.
Yeah,
they were dissected and autopsied in the name of furthering medicine. But of course, these were poor
without
people
their consent.
Who didn't consent.
Yeah,
and then they weren't given a burial. They were kind of thrown into the creek, or maybe they were buried in a shallow grave and. So I think that's where you're going to get your cursed activity.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert.
And just as an aside, there was also a pest house on 26th Street with a lot of people with leprosy, smallpox, other illnesses.
Syphilis, yeah.
Many of them died there. Probably were buried elsewhere, but they were very, very sick people.
What did you call it?
It's called the Pest House.
Pest.
It was literally called the Pest House. Yeah. It was a quarantine and isolation hospital.
Yeah.
But that's what they called them back then.
26 and what?
DeHaro, I think.
Yeah, by where the hospital is now.
No, a little further away.
Oh,
but yeah,
further away.
nearby. And again, like far away from where people were living.
Yeah.
Bonnie.
You mentioned briefly some event that took place last year. Could you elaborate on that? Because I didn't catch that.
I think she means the monument.
Yeah, the landmarking of City Cemetery and the installation of the sign that tells people what was there and reminds people that the graves are still there.
Is there anybody in city government that is championing this movement?
I mean, that one specifically was Connie Chan, Supervisor Connie Chan, because it's in her territory. But I don't know if any of the others are. I've thought about reaching out to, I don't even know who's in charge of the Yerba Buena territory right now, but I've thought about, is it Matt Dorsey?
Probably.
I don't know if he'd go for it, though.
I don't know. It was unanimous, the landmarking. Yeah. Nobody opposed it. But that's, again, because they weren't, it was a low-stakes situation. Mm-hmm. It's just installing a marker, right? They're not, nobody's asking to build condos on it or anything. So, yeah.
Hopefully it'll stay that way.
Yes.
Wasn't there a cemetery like Telegraph Hill area, like the sailors? There was Russian sailors.
Well, there was one for, it was called the Sailors Burying Ground, Sansom and Broadway. So down the hill from Telegraph Hill. But then there was another one called Russian Hill Cemetery that was on where the peak of Russian Hill is. That was specifically Russian sailors. I mean, talking about like segregating your dead. The Russian Orthodox people wanted to be buried separate from the other sailors.
But don't you think that you have a family and you're Russian Orthodox and you have a funeral, you go to the Russian Orthodox area just because that's your church?
Well, this was before there was this was before there was a church. This was like Russian sailors coming in on boats and dying on the boats on the way in.
Go amongst their own.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't like you're segregated. It's just you go with your people.
Yeah.
Wait, I have a question about that. There is I'm sorry.
No, I'm just
Oh, okay. That's allowed. Was a rumor, like in old-fashioned newspaper accounts and stories, that there was a gallows at the Russian Hill Sailors Cemetery. The rumor, I think, was that the gallows was there so that they could execute him and then just like put him in the ground. Is that true? Sounds like no. You're shaking your head.
No.
Debunked.
I think there was a gallows nearby, but it was for like vigilante justice, not for
cool
poor sailors coming to San Francisco. You in the hoodie.
How much do you cover in the book about funeral home histories in San Francisco?
Oh, very, very little. But I did just write a profile on Duggan's, which is one of the oldest ones in San Francisco. So I got a little bit into it there. But yeah, a lot of the funeral homes that were in operation during this burial period that I'm talking about, they're long gone. And a lot of the ones that are more recently gone started up after the cemeteries moved to Colma. So, and I wasn't covering that history in such detail. Do you have a specific question about that, or?
No, I just wondered.
Yeah, it's a separate history. It's also really fascinating. So, yeah, you here.
Maybe you covered it because I came in late.
Mhm.
How did the Oddfellows keep their mausoleum? And now I know it's now Neptune Society.
Yeah.
Oh, the columbarium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did that politically happen? Was it just disrepair no one noticed?
You know, that's a good question. And even though I write about it in the book, I don't have a complete answer other than, I think because it was cremated remains, and a structure, like they didn't want to demolish a structure. And it did, of course, it fell into disrepair for decades and was fixed back up in the 80s and 90s too. And it looks nicer now than it did when it was built. And it's still like a great place to visit the old dead of San Francisco, and people are still being interred there now. It's one of the few places left, and I think they're even creating like new spaces.
Yeah, they're
outside.
expanding it. It's also a small footprint in terms of, you think about these cemeteries were acres big, right? I mean, the columbarium's on like 1 acre.
Yeah.
It's like a little small footprint. So.
I think the Neptune Society has something to do with it.
Oh,
Yeah.
could be. Yeah.
Well, they bought it
Yeah.
after.
Yeah.
That's.
Yeah. Yes.
If I could just make a comment on my impression of what this history shows us about San Francisco. It's diverse,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it still is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's innovative,
Mm-hmm.
and it still is, we hope. And it's dynamic, right? Things are changing.
All the time.
And all of that is in this history,
Yeah.
and hopefully, I think it is, still part of us.
I hope so
still
too.
part of the city.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I want to happen as a result of this book is that I want more people to be aware of this one aspect. Like, the dead are still here, they're still among us, and even though we're using these lands for other purposes now, like, I think it's useful and interesting to remember that, like, the people who created the city that we have are still here.
Yeah. And it's a way of honoring our history,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
I think another thing along the lines of what you were saying is that this town is always in a hurry to move on, right? Like, we don't want to remember the history so much here. Like, maybe some of it, like cable cars, Golden Gate Bridge, Gold Rush, but like, there's a lot of stuff where it's just like, pave it over, let's put the next building up, right? Like, this industry's dead, on to the next. And I think that thinking about who was there and is still here is a way to to honor the past a little bit and to reflect on it.
Yeah. Any other questions? We've stumped them. All right, well, let's wrap up.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming,
Thanks
everybody.
For having me.
Good to see you all. I will be signing books.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, there are books up there you can grab and have them sign them and bring one to me, or come get some from me.
Yeah, definitely buy Beth's book. There's a lot more information in there and lots of good pictures.
Let me find my pen. Oh, and I.
Oh, you did?
This story was never, I never heard anything. About that there was a cemetery? No. I'm telling you, they don't want to talk about it.
I gotta find it.
About it.
They don't even know.
And I think it's important to know, don't you think?
Yes, of course.
And there is surely still.
Well, I have a Sharpie. There it is.
Yeah.
Okay.